Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. In 5 days' time, on the 7th of December, Raghuram Rajan's newest book will be published, and here it is. It's called Breaking the Mould, Reimagining India's Economic Future. And along with his co-author Rohit Lamba, the book explains Dr. Rajan's vision for the economic future of the country. And that raises two fundamental questions. What is that vision, and why does Dr. Rajan believe it is the right one for the country? Joining me live from New York is Dr. Rajan himself. Dr. Rajan, you start the introduction of your book with the following intriguing question. Where is India going today, you ask? And then you continue, is it surging, having just overtaken the United Kingdom to become the fifth largest economy in the world? Or is it flailing, having settled at a growth rate that is grossly insufficient to provide jobs for the millions joining the labor force? Your book, of course, is the long answer, but what is the short answer?
Well, Karan, thanks for having me first. And of course, this book is joint with Rohit Lamba. Now, actually, both statements are true. We are growing faster than other large economies, but that's partly because we are a poor country. Poor countries grow faster because catch up growth is easier. There's so much more to do, and we know what to do. Also, because we are populous, we are overtaking countries like the United Kingdom that are much richer per person but have far fewer people. And so that's the good side we hear so much about. But we also have a very high unemployment rate. The CMIE said it was 8% in August. These numbers fluctuate a lot, but these unemployment rates are poorly measured. What is clear is that labor force participation, that is, what fraction of the working population is actually working or looking for work, that is an abysmal 40%. So only 40% of people who are capable of working either have a job or are looking for work. So we're not utilizing 60% of the workforce. And in the longer run, if we don't provide jobs for these people, it has to be concerning because we'll waste a lot of talent, a lot of capability. And as crores of young people look for work and don't find it, they will get more frustrated. We are really in danger of wasting our demographic dividend. So both sides are true. The question is, which is the more worrying? And I would say the second.
Now, in fact, the CMIE has said that the unemployment rate shot up by the end of October to 10.05%, almost 2% above the 8%. At the moment, growth in quarter two has just come in as 7.6%. In quarter one, it was 7.8%. And the RBI expects that overall growth for this year will be 6.5%, which is why our government takes great pride in saying we are the fastest growing major economy. But in a recent talk to a Chinese audience, you said that India needs to create 70 million jobs in the next 10 years, and you added that would require a growth rate around 8 or 8.5%. In fact, you also pointed out that even 7.5% would only tackle two-thirds of the job problem. How likely is it that the present economic thinking and policies that we're following in the country can lift growth to 8.5% levels?
Well, I think that to some extent, if you look at the last 4 years and you sort of take off the ups and downs, we've been growing at about 4%. Now, we certainly, over the last few quarters, are growing much faster, and we need to keep this up. But as you just said, it will not be enough. Think about China, which when it was at our level of per capita GDP, which is about the early 2000s, it had double digit rates of real growth. And that is what kept people employed. Now, we don't just have to, employ the people entering the labor force. We also have to make up for the people who entered in the past and haven't found jobs. So it's not just growth, but the job intensity of growth, which is very important. And, just an example of where this might be going off track. I mean, we just invited Micron to set up a factory in India, subsidizing it to the tune of $2 billion. How many jobs is it going to create? It's going to create 5,000 jobs. So, in a sense, we've got a subsidy of close to $400,000 per job. That seems excessive when in fact there are so many people who are unemployed. These state elections, for which we'll get the results tomorrow, are all about government jobs. But the government cannot employ everyone. The private sector has to step up. But capital intensive manufacturing like the Micron factory is not going to do it. We need people intensive jobs. The quality of growth matters, and that's what we need to start thinking about.
Now, in fact, your book explains why the present path of development that the Indian government is pursuing, which is the Chinese path of development, which you describe as the path up from low skilled manufacturing exports, is unlikely to work for India. It worked for China, but you believe it's unlikely to work for India in the same way. First, to say this is because China and others are already there and have competed down profits. In other words, I assume what you're saying is that the world has changed compared to what it was in the 70s and 80s and compared to what it is today, which is why what China did then cannot necessarily work for us today. But could you explain this point a little further, please?
Exactly. I mean, what happened when China sort of started on its manufacturing path in a big way in the early 80s was it was largely competing with the US. You've heard about the number of job losses in the US as a result of Chinese manufacturing. So when a low skilled but a cheap labor country is competing with a costly labor country, you can compete very effectively because you are essentially competing with your cheap labor. Now, as time went on, China not only improved the quality of its labor, but it also improved the other deficiencies which was making China was holding China back. For example, its infrastructure, the power, utilities, its ports, its airports. And now what we have is a China which still has a lot of unemployed people in the Western provinces, a lot of people still employed in agriculture, but it also has first world infrastructure facilities. So we're competing not with the United States. Those jobs have long gone from the United States. We're not competing with Europe. We're competing with China. Not just China, of course, because the Vietnams of the world are also now competing in that space. So it is tough competition. It's not that we cannot succeed, but the value added from that competition is extremely limited. So in a sense, if you look at assembly, which is where we want to create jobs, that is the least value added part of the global supply chain today. And one example to make this very clear is take Foxconn, which does all the assembly for Apple. The net worth of Foxconn is about $50 billion. That's how much markets value it. The net worth of Apple, which manufactures nothing, but creates the ideas, the intellectual capital, the design, the content in your Apple iPhone, that is over 3 trillion. So it's 60 times the manufacturing side. That gives you a sense of how global value chains have moved. A lot of the content is in the early stages when you're designing, doing the R&D, creating the patents, and also in the late stages when you're doing the marketing, the financing, as well as creating content for the device that you're creating. In the middle, which is where the manufacturing takes place, there's not that much value added. So this is what sometimes economists call the value added smile. In the early stages, there's a lot of it, then it goes down and it comes back up in the late stages when again you're talking about a lot of skills and value added.
I'll come to that tantalizing phrase, the smile curve, which you referred to a moment ago, in a little while. But first of all, let me point out your book also says that there are specific differences between China and India that made China well suited to follow the path of low skilled manufacturing exports, and which, in a very real sense, work against India when India tries to do the same. These are, as you point out, the difference in education of the workforce, differences in levels of competition, and perhaps most importantly, the fact that China could suppress salaries and interest rates, keep its exchange rate low, and enforce tough labor laws, all of which India as a democracy would find very hard to do. And this last point in particular leads you to say something that I'd like you to explain further. You say, and I'm quoting you, arguably, India may have democratized too early. Perhaps strong manufacturing growth in its early years required an authoritarian hand to remove the obstacle in the way of development. Could you explain that point a little bit more?
Yes, I mean, first, I think it bears emphasizing that China had a lot going for it, even when it started on the manufacturing path. And one big difference, which we point out in the book, is the level of education of Chinese workers was much higher than when India started embarking on its, liberalization path. And that difference still exists today, and it now demonstrates more in terms of the quality of education as much as the levels of education. But that, let's put that aside. Um, the other important thing to note is when you look at East Asian economies which grew, they typically started off as more authoritarian economies. They didn't have democracy. They were one-party systems with fairly authoritarian leaders. And at some point, as they grew richer, as they developed, they eventually liberalized. But this was after they had done a lot of development. Why might that be so? Why might it take early years under more authoritarian government, and then later years you liberalize and become stronger democracies, as South Korea or Taiwan have become? And the answer may be that in the early years, the direction you need to go is clear because you're doing catch up growth. Others have gone on this path, you know which direction to go. But really, what you need to do is create the kind of environment which gives you an advantage. And in the case of many of these countries, it was suppressing labor unions, pushing down wages, keeping wages low, using cheap labor as a source of competitive advantage, pushing down the rates of return that savers in the middle class got so that firms could get cheap capital. That was something that China did. And also building out infrastructure without worrying about whose land you were taking up. You just built it out. The bridges, the highways, land acquisition was easy. These are the pathways that many of these countries followed. And by the time they liberalized, a lot of this stuff was done, and they could move upscale. They could now start tolerating more unions. They could pay their middle class high interest rates on their savings and so on. So this is true of many East Asian countries. There are two, and it is also actually true of the United States and the United Kingdom. They too essentially liberalized down the line, not in the early years, because after all, democracy, really flourished in the United States and the United Kingdom, but they already were moderately rich. There are two outliers to this development path. One is China, which never became a democracy over the course of development. And the other is India, which started by being a democracy. And so we're speculating that perhaps if you wanted to go down that manufacturing path as successfully as the others did, apart from things like better education for your people, which the communist countries did very well, perhaps you also needed a little bit of a more authoritarian government, which we didn't have, perhaps to our benefit because we had stronger unions protecting worker rights, and perhaps because our middle class savers got more returns on their savings. Those are not necessarily bad things, but they may explain why we couldn't follow that path.
Against this background, where you've explained why the Chinese path to development is not feasible for us, let's come to what you believe is the right path for us. I'm going to quote you because you put it very pithily. You say India should compete for the future rather than the past. In other words, you add India must pivot from brawn to brain even at this early stage of development. And this, as you say, is to use services exports as its path to development, both direct services and manufacturing related ones. Now, this is something you've written about in articles, it's something that you've done in speeches, and it's something I've interviewed you about before as well. But for the benefit of those who haven't read the articles and have missed the interviews you and I have done, can you explain this critical point further?
Well, I think what we're saying is if you look at these global value chains, rather than competing for the lowest part of the value chain, which is what really happens if you want to be like China and bring low-skilled assembly to India and then hope that building on that, we will do more manufacturing down the line. Instead, look at what we're already doing. Look at the places we are successful and ask the question, why can't we build on that? Because in the places we are successful, we are much more, we've scaled the value added ladder much more than in the places where we haven't been successful. So take one example. There is something called a global competency center. Goldman Sachs, for example, has 8,000 workers in Bengaluru. Who are doing all sorts of models, risk management, high-level work for Goldman Sachs across the world. There are 1,600 of such centers in India, which is about 40% of the world number. Clearly, global firms find that hiring high quality Indian labor, well educated Indian labor, our engineers, our management graduates, our data analytics people, that actually is something where they still find a lot of value in India. A friend of mine was going to India to hire consultants into her firm. I said, "Yeah, what are you doing this for? Are they going to be back office people?" Said, "No. What happened during the pandemic is that we found we could service, Denver from Chicago via Zoom and other conference calling devices." And so then we started asking, well, why can't we service Denver from India? After all, we have really bright graduates there, and they earn a fraction of what our management consultants in the US earn. Why can't we put them in the front office rather than in the back office? Why can't they make presentations to clients? Why can't they do the actual analysis? And that, to my mind, is something that is now feasible. You can do presentations to Denver from Kotagiri in Tamil Nadu. You don't have to be in Denver. And that is opening a whole range of activities, not just direct services like consulting, but services focused on manufacturing. There are many cars today. The Chevy Volt, for example, consists more of software than actual parts. 10 million lines of code. And who does that? It's services provided by people from India. 20% of chip design is done from India. We met one of the entrepreneurs who led a chip design team, the best in the world for a big multinational. So there's lots of things we're doing really well. Why don't we focus on increasing the number of Indians who can do that and essentially leapfrog the growth part? Don't start with the lowest end and follow the path that others have. Instead, create your own path, the Indian way rather than the Chinese way.
In fact, in essence, what you're saying, Dr. Rajan, is that the foundation already exists in India for what you're proposing. We need to, in a sense, build on it. What you're proposing is neither novel nor untried. It's something that we have already begun doing. And as you pointed out, in addition to IT services, in the last 4 years, India is also already exporting professional and management consultancy services. Many of the world's manufacturers have large R&D and design outfits already established and working in India. You pointed out that 20% of chip design is done in India. 40% of the world's global capacity centers are located in India. In other words, we've got the foundation. We now need to build on it.
Right, and we are also creating tremendous numbers of jobs in 2023 in these global capacity centers. Thus far, we've employed 280,000 people. Uh, that's a big number for the kind of job we're talking about, which is really high-paying jobs. So we have a proof of concept, but it's not just about service exports, right? Think of the huge market for services in our country. How much more medical services is there need for? And we're not talking just about employing doctors in providing more medical services. Can we train up that compounder who now provides informal services to people? Can we him up to recognize, a variety of diseases so that he becomes much more effective at what he does? Can we bring him more centrally into the labor force? Think of how much demand there is for education. Everybody wants a decent school for their kids. Everybody wants a good college for their students. 50% of Indian graduates, by one survey, are unemployable. What if we made them employable? What if we improve the quality of education? So there's so much opportunity. There's also tremendous opportunity for increasing the demand for goods and services. Think, for example, we talk in the book about a firm called Lenscraft, which basically combines services and manufacturing. They will essentially come and measure your eyesight, either in the store or by agents who come to your home. And then within 2 days, they will deliver a pair of eyeglasses to your home. This combines services and manufacturing, but fixes a very real need in Indians, that many people have weak eyesight and don't really know they have a problem. They're going closer and closer to the TV or holding the book closer and closer to their face. Lenscraft tries to solve that problem. It is already a 5,000 crore company, but these are the kinds of innovations we need, and we can do so much more of them, employing so many more people.
Absolutely. In fact, the truth is, as you pointed out very accurately, services is not just a matter of exports. There's a huge demand for health services and education services within our own country. After all, we have a population of 1.4 billion. Let's then at this point come to the critical challenges that have to be tackled for your vision for economic development to actually become a reality. The first is education, and in particular, the need for first-rate universities that can do the research that will lead to breakthrough products. But is that as easy as it sounds? We have actually ended up with a situation where the quality of our university education is deteriorating, not improving.
Yeah. No, nothing is easy. I don't want to say any of this is easy, but once you have determination, India can do pretty much anything. So that is what we want to bank on. Now, regardless of whether you think manufacturing or services or some combination is the answer, you absolutely have to improve the education of our people. I started by saying how we were below China in terms of education. But with growing automation in manufacturing, the advent of robots, the use of artificial intelligence in services, even for ordinary jobs, you have to have higher education to stay ahead of the game, to make people employable. Now, what is interesting is over the last 20 years, we created an enormous number of colleges and universities in the country, at a phenomenal rate, many, many colleges a day. But unfortunately, as you pointed out, these are only of moderate quality. We absolutely need to upgrade them. Similarly, we talk about being a Vishwa Guru, but we have only actually we have no university in the top 100 in the world. But we have the capability of getting there. We should not despair. I was part of a group which founded Kriya University 4 years ago. We've graduated 2 batches of students, very, very smart students, and we've got top-notch faculty. So it is possible when there's a will. But most importantly, I would say, to take us much further in terms of education. We should draw on all the talent we have around the world. We have an extremely qualified diaspora. The Chinese did this. The Chinese built a tremendous university system over the last 10, 15 years. And the quality of their research has just become outstanding. And we can do the same. We can do that by drawing on all the talented Indians around the world, but also talented foreigners. Draw them to our country to teach. And it is not impossible to do it, but also think of how much we are spending in terms of resources, sending our kids to universities abroad, over 7 lakh leaving every year. We could save all that. Education would become an import substitution industry if we could create strong universities in the country, keeping our young people there, eventually sending them abroad to do PhDs and so on, and come back to teach the rest. So, I mean, we need a better system. It is possible. It is something that we need to work on.
Now, the second channel is in fact probably even more difficult than the first. The first being improving our education system. The second is to persuade the world to be open to areas such as Indian telemedicine, Indian legal consultancy. This means the world has to accept that our professional degrees and also accept and acknowledge that we have equivalence in subjects like medicine and law. Again, how easy will it be to convince the world that we are as good as them in medicine and legal consultancy?
It's actually happening. And this is again where our diaspora has helped by sending the message around the world that Indians are really, really good. Talk to any taxi driver in the US and he'll say, "Are you a doctor?" Because he has experience of a good Indian doctor that he has used. But more generally, I think we can bring this to the front of the agenda as we negotiate treaties with other countries. I know this is part of what we're negotiating with the UK, but it can be a win-win situation. I mean, think about the United Kingdom. Their problem is their National Health Service is so far backed up because they simply don't have the doctors. They're not producing the doctors in the UK. Now, perhaps they would benefit from going, 20% of their patients could go to telemedicine. We could create better telemedicine facilities with, some nurse practitioners in the UK taking temperature, taking weight, and doing some activities for a doctor who's supervising them, for example, in India. There is a win-win situation possible here as the West ages and looks for the kind of people that would help it, provide services to their own people. But at the same time, they don't have to come over, and the West doesn't have to deal with the problem of huge immigration, to boot. So I think we can do this. We also have to recognize that we keep out their activities. I mean, there's a very strong, lawyer lobby in India which prevents foreign law firms from doing business in India. There's a win-win reciprocal arrangement where our lawyers can do business there, their lawyers can come and do business here. But also, as far as medical facilities go, it is possible for Indian students to take US exams now online. What they can't do is the final sort of practice test where they identify patients, meet with real patients and diagnose their diseases. But we could work out arrangements where those kinds of tests could be done in India so that Indian students don't necessarily have to incur the expense of going there. But these are all matters of negotiation. They're not impossible. In fact, one should even negotiate that the National Health Service in the UK should pay for that Indian doctor providing the services. And maybe if people in the UK get it cheaper, faster, it's something that will benefit them tremendously. So we need to make these arguments much more clearly and carefully.
Now, there is also, Dr. Rajan, a third challenge, and it refers specifically to the government we have and the sort of country India is steadily, increasingly becoming. I'm referring to the relationship between democracy and creativity. You write in your book, and I'm quoting you, pluralism, free speech, independent institutions, a vibrant civil society, and checks and balances on government are not just a concern of the liberal elite in Lachan's Delhi, they are essential for the creativity-based growth path we propose. If anything, India is moving further and further away from this. Worse, it's only a minority or perhaps an elite that object.
I think this is a very important point. What we are also trying to argue with this book is that we have some strengths, our democracy, but not just the democracy, the institutions that help democracy sustain. Those are all very important. And why is that important, right? You have to make the case to people. This is not just about some people talking about liberalism in elite corners. Bottom up, what we are talking about in the book is a revolution in how social services are provided. We want much more, focus not on freebies and revadies, whatever you want to call them, but on, providing healthcare, providing education. We talk a lot in the book about decentralization, which will allow people to hold their government officials to task. But what is important also is they feel they're protected if they hold that government official to task. They're not, they're not ignored, or they're not worse, put in jail because they dared protest. So bottom-up protest is an important part of democracy. It helps make government work for the people, and that requires transparency about how government is working, requires data, and requires the ability to protest. So that's one part of it. The second is, if you think about innovation, you think about challenge, it means subverting the dominant paradigm, proving your own professor wrong and saying, "You're wrong, you taught me, but I don't believe what you said is right because I'm making an advance," in a sense, standing on your shoulders to look further. Uh, a top-down hierarchy where the boss is always right, where the government is always right, suppresses that kind of innovation, suppresses good science, suppresses creativity, whether it's in the arts or culture, because you're sort of, in a sense, shackled by what is permissible. You can't offend anybody. You can't offend her higher up. You have to do what is within the domain of the permissible. You can see it in China today with AI being restricted so that it never challenges the dominance of the Communist Party. I mean, if you put those kinds of restrictions, it's going to be a big dampener on what kinds of activities people do. But the last and most important part also is we're talking about a different path for India, an innovative path, a path which is different from what any other country has done. No country has developed in a generation by focusing on human capital development, on developing its most important asset, its people. That's what we're talking about. But for that, you need to be able to course correct when you make mistakes, and any government will make mistakes. But for that, the government has to know it's made a mistake by allowing people to essentially get the data, look at it, and criticize the government. You're making a mistake here. The government has to learn from that criticism, first by allowing it, and then debating with the critics and thinking about how it can change, and then eventually change, course correct, and keep doing that till it gets it right. So that's what a democracy permits. And that's what we need to keep alive. We cannot have an authoritarian system where all criticism is suppressed, because that will ensure we simply do not progress.
No one, Dr. Rajan, would dispute for a moment the link you're drawing between democracy and freedom on the one hand and creativity on the other. The concern is that A, we have a government that is authoritarian and doesn't recognize that and believes that, in fact, within the restraints and constraints that we impose, growth is possible. But the second is perhaps a cultural problem. The Indian Gurukul tradition always enforces the belief that the guru is right no matter what. It doesn't leave room for the student to challenge the professor and say, "You taught me, but you're wrong."
I
Those are
think
two problems, one authoritarian government, the other cultural thinking, that we'll have to overcome, won't we?
Well, yes, but we've had more liberal governments over time, and I think we need to go back to asking our question: what is the best kind of government stance as we look to the future? Do we need many more buildings, statues, monuments, or do we need to invest in people's brains, in human capital, in occupying the high ground in terms of creativity and innovation? And if it is the latter, we also need to think about how government sort of permits that by being more liberal about debate, about criticism, about ideas. On the cultural, I mean, I think you can find a lot of examples in in Indian culture of students also subverting their teachers, polite ways. But they have challenged what they were taught. Yes, you're right that the dominant paradigm is the teacher's always right. That was in some ways a way of assuring obedience. But we need to also break out of that, and there are enough examples in our history and in our culture to suggest that that need not be the only paradigm.
Let me at this point go back to that wonderfully phrased concept, the smile curve. I want to raise it not as a solution, but as a challenge that you have to convince Indian politicians of. The reason you believe the services route to manufactured based sorry, the development route through manufactured services is the right one is because of this smile curve. As you explained, most of the value addition in a product is at the beginning and at the end of the supply chain, where services are embedded in the product. Today, the manufacturing portion, where moderately skilled workers across emerging markets compete to reduce costs, accounts for far less value than it used to. Most of the value is either at the beginning or at the end, which is why you get that smile, the curve. The problem, and this is what I want to put to you, is that Indian politicians are convinced that the manufacturing route is the right one. They either don't know of the smile curve, or if they do, they don't recognize that that is where the value lies. And to convince them, you have to change their thinking. It's not just their prejudices and their practices, but their thinking and their attitudes that need to be changed. How easy would it be to do that?
Well, Indian politicians aren't the only ones in the world who have this manufacturing fetishism. Even in the U.S., this desire to somehow bring back manufacturing, even though service companies like Nvidia or Apple are so much more valuable than any manufacturing company in the world. I think this is something that even politicians in the US do not understand. So we're in the midst of spending enormous subsidies in the United States to get manufacturing into the United States at huge cost, which will create so chip manufacturing they're trying to bring in, and it's going to create a glut of chips. Now India has to be sensible and say, well, do we really think we can become completely independent in chip manufacture? Uh, we can't. Even if you do everything else, you'd still need to buy the machines to make those chips from ASML in Netherlands. You have to buy the wafers from somewhere else in the world. You cannot become independent on chip manufacturing no matter what you do, even if you cite some foundries in India, which will be enormously expensive. Instead, why don't you take advantage of the fact that these countries are all sort of succumbing to the manufacturing fetish, building chip factories, buy them cheap from Germany, buy them cheap from the US. Periodically, chip industries have a glut. Be more sensible. Focus on chip design. Can we train up the engineers who can do that chip design? Why can't we create an Indian chip design firm? Nvidia is hugely successful. Maybe we don't achieve that quickly, but we achieve that over time. It'll be far less expensive, and perhaps we'll train many more good engineers to do far more things if we do that. So yes, you have to change thinking, but I think it's not unique to India. It's across the world. Instead, you would hope Indians are a little more sensible about this and say, let the rest of the world sort of follow this manufacturing route. It'll just make manufactured goods cheaper for us, and we'll buy them then. Bottom line again is, why is Apple 60 times the value of Foxconn, which does the manufacturing for Apple?
Absolutely. Now, there is a second intriguing question you raise in your book. Can India become rich before it becomes old? Would I be right in saying the answer is if India doesn't follow your prescription, it could become old but remain stuck in what's called the middle income range?
Quite possibly. I mean, I don't want to say that I have all the answers. I'm saying it's time we sort of thought about the answers. And here's why I'm saying this. Uh, Today, 35% of our children suffer from malnutrition, right? We talk about becoming a developed country by 2047. These kids are going to reach adulthood around that time. If 35% of your labor force has stunted minds and cannot perform at the average level that a worker should perform, what kind of labor force will you have? So unless we fix these problems today, we have much more limited chances of bringing everybody up into that glorious future we keep envisioning. And that means today we need to think about the quality of primary education. We need to think about malnutrition. We need to think about healthcare. These are things which will create a sound, healthy population, which can then learn and absorb all that we want to teach them and become highly productive workers, and then take us to that rich world that we keep talking about 20, 25 years from now. But we need to do the work today. And that's why I think that, we need to understand what we really need to focus on. We need to imagine the future. Once we imagine the future, we need to understand the challenges of getting there. And that, to my mind, is what we're trying to do in the book.
Before I end, let me point out something inherent in what you just said. If only India had paid the sort of adequate attention it needs to pay to health and education 75 years earlier, we could have been a very, very different country today. But I'll end by pointing out something that you yourself said a moment ago. You accept no developing country has taken this path before, and then you add in your book, India can. You say, if we break the mold to follow a truly Indian way, our future could be one of extraordinary well-being within a couple of decades. But if we don't, and are molded by the past experiences of other countries, it will be left to our children to lament as they think of the India that might have been. So this is truly a sort of make or break moment for the country. If India takes this advice, it could succeed. Otherwise, it will languish in what Shakespeare called shallows and miseries.
Well, I hope not. We truly think India's future could be spectacular, but it won't happen if we keep thumping ourselves on the chest and saying we're great. We are not great as yet. We need to do the homework. And there's, as you've pointed out many times during this interview, there are many challenges. But if we take them on board, we could get there. But we have to start today. And that's why the urgency of the book, that, there's a lot to do. Let's not get complacent. Let's not say we've arrived. We have a long way to go.
Absolutely. We're not Vishwa Gurus, we're Chelas. But if we perform the right task of Chelas and do the right things, we will be Vishwa Gurus within 20, 25 years. But the whole thing hinges on our politicians, and beyond that, our country accepting that we need to rethink our development policy. We need to open our eyes to the possibilities, and only then will we realize our potential. Dr. Rajan, I thank you for this interview. I'm going to hold up your book once again, because I think this is a book that challenges not only India's thinking, but also opens India's eyes to the future that is possible if people recognize the wisdom within these pages. Thank you very much indeed for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.